Consciousness is a large term that involves basically thinking and feeling and how they can be observed and measured. And there are now serious thinkers and theorists who maintain that consciousness is absolutely basic to life in general. Humans not only have consciousness, there's evidence that other apes have consciousness, even birds have consciousness, and you can even make the case that butterflies and spiders have consciousness, and that fungi and trees have consciousness, depending on how you define the term.
Professor Stanley Krippner stands as a true trailblazer in the realm of consciousness exploration, pushing boundaries by delving into cross-culture perspectives and the intriguing realm of non-ordinary experiences that boldly challenge conventional paradigms. With an extensive body of work, he is an award-winning prolific author, personal mythology, and varieties of anomalous experience, and an esteemed researcher diving into diverse subjects such as dreaming, psychedelics, creativity, shamanism, parapsychology, and trauma.
It's a pleasure to be here, Rhonda. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. It's such a pleasure to see you again. We ran out of time the last time we spoke because there was so much more that I wanted you to talk about. And so today I'd like you to speak about the exploration of consciousness.
Well, I think you have to realize that the exploration of consciousness was not really a part of mainstream American psychology for many, many decades. The predominant paradigm was behaviorism, which focused on measuring behavior and how can you measure something ephemeral like consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
It was not until cognitive psychology came into the picture that the exploration of thinking and feeling began to be explored. And this is followed by humanistic and transpersonal psychology. And now explorations of consciousness are blossoming all over the place. So the exploration of consciousness can take many, many forms. And my focus has been on a few of those forms, such as exploring consciousness through psychedelics, through dreams, through hypnosis, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many, many other explorations of consciousness that other researchers are very, very adroitly carrying out.
Mm-hmm.
I should mention that in psychiatry, Sigmund Freud and Carl Gustav Jung were exploring consciousness in very, very different ways, but their explorations never really permeated mainstream American psychology. Now, at last, I think their contributions are being acknowledged.
Mm-hmm.
So, the explorations of consciousness that I have been engaged in take many forms, and I don't know what your listeners and viewers would be most interested in. What do you think?
Well, I think that we're just moving into an age where science is starting to recognize that consciousness is really who we are. Because once we die, there's a part of us that's missing, and that's our consciousness. And I think that people today want to know more about that.
First of all, we have to define what we mean by the word consciousness because there are so many definitions.
Okay.
And for me, consciousness is a large term that involves basically thinking and feeling
Yes.
and how they can be observed and measured. And there are now serious thinkers and theorists who maintain that consciousness is absolutely basic to life in general. humans not only have consciousness, there's evidence that other apes have consciousness, even birds have consciousness, and you can even make the case that butterflies and spiders have consciousness, and that fungi and trees have consciousness, depending on how you define the term. Fungi can actually make decisions, so can tree roots correspond with each other. And making decisions is an important part of consciousness, and many forms of life can do this. Also, dreaming is a part of consciousness, and we now have evidence that rats and mice have rapid eye movement sleep, which probably indicates they're dreaming in some way or another.
Yes.
Even birds have some rapid eye movement sleep, and the case can be made that other forms of life, such as butterflies and spiders, have sleep cycles that have a unique aspect that looks very much like they're going into what humans would call rapid eye movement sleep. So consciousness is all around us. I think that you make an interesting point that some aspect of consciousness survives bodily death. And this would have been not given serious consideration decades ago by mainstream psychology.
Mm-hmm.
But now we have a lot of evidence indicating that life goes on. The American Psychological Association recently published a book, Death as an Altered State of Consciousness. In the book, they talk about evidence from mediums, from near-death experiences, from out-of-body experiences, from past life reports. Now, again, the American Psychological Association does represent mainstream psychology. So the fact that these topics are being serious attention is a major breakthrough for this type of exploration. Just for example, there are so many reports now of children who remember events from supposed past lives. And this has been a topic of exploration at the University of Virginia for decades, starting with Ian Stevenson, continuing with people who followed in his footsteps. And I have had the opportunity to interview a young girl who claimed that she was a friend of mine in her past life. And her friend died 100 years to the date. My friend died 100 years from the date to the time that this young girl was born. And the young girl is remembering things that she would have no ordinary way of knowing about how my friend escaped the Nazis at the outbreak of the Second World War and escaped and came to America. And I cannot give too many details because this whole case is about to be published in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. I think that in my own research, I've interviewed a young woman who has had some dreams about soldiers who died in the ill-begotten American wars in the Middle East. And these dreams she brought to a collaborator who was in the U.S. Army, a veteran, and he knew each one of those young men, and there's enough information in her dreams so he could identify them by name. And then they went into the Army records, and sure enough, there was their name, their operation, and even the name of their company. And I published all of this in the Journal of Psychical Research. So there were 10 solid cases where she had dreams that matched the historical records of these veterans who had died on the battlefield. Quite remarkable. Now, a lot of people discounted mediums, but by mediums we mean people who claim to be in communication with people who are no longer alive and getting messages from them. But I happen to know the most famous medium of the 20th century, Eileen Garrett, and she regularly volunteered her services to science, and she kept careful records of everything that she did, and her records have been carefully preserved by her daughter and her granddaughter. And I remember one case where a man came to her when she was doing her mediumship work and said, "You've got to find my wife. She's in distress." And Eileen passed the word on, and the authorities in England said, "No, she's fine." And she had a dream again. He said, "You must find my wife. She's in distress." So Eileen persisted, and finally the police were able to break into the house, and they found his wife on the floor, almost dead, and she had no way of getting to a telephone, no way of alerting people that she had fallen and was dying. And fortunately, she was rushed to the hospital and revived, and she survived. Now, that was a clear-cut case of someone from the other side intervening to save the life of a loved one. I also think that the most famous medium from Brazil, Chico Xavier, had left a legacy of scientific work about his work. He was able to use the word shadow, get information from so-called spirits, and he would write essays and poems and even plays. And when handwriting and linguistic authorities checked what he had written, no way did they compare with his ordinary writings. Some of his plays are so good they've actually been produced, and some of his novels have been made into films, so they've been good enough to reach a wider audience. So the case goes on and on and on, and I think we really need to take these reports seriously. Ralph Metzger was one of the great explorations of consciousness in the United States, and he went so far as to say, when someone comes into the world, their personality is shaped by genetics, by the environment, everybody agrees on that, and by their past life experiences. He said past life experiences were a third determinant of a person's personality. So as I say, some decades ago, none of this would be taken seriously, and now it needs some serious attention.
And now it's starting to become more serious. I mean, people are paying attention because the more these stories are verified, the more we see there is an essence about us that returns. Sometimes, maybe not always, but do you think that?
Well, of course, not all of these reports should be taken seriously. Some of them are sure fantasies.
Yes.
Some of the people who claim to be mediums are just amateurs trying to get attention.
Yes.
This is why science comes into the picture to shift and winnow what reports are valid and which ones are the results of fantasy, of mental illness, or of attention getting. It's a tricky business, but that's what science is all about. Evaluating the claims with disciplined inquiry and hard evidence. Again, your viewers and listeners might look into the book, Death of an Altered State of Consciousness by Iman Burris, published by the American Psychological Association last year, and some of the other accounts such as the autobiographies, there were several of them, of Eileen Garrett. And again, there is so much nonsense in this field. One has to be very, very careful and check the credentials of what is being read and what is being heard and listened to. Common sense and critical thinking are so important in making these evaluations.
Thank you very much. So, when it comes to psychedelics, have you had any experience with how psychedelics change brain in order for someone to see more than they would not under psychedelics?
My history of psychedelics goes back half a century or more, and I first became interested in psychedelics when I read an article in Life magazine about a Mexican shaman by the name of Maria Sabina who used sacred mushrooms in rituals to assist clients of hers who were having serious problems. So they were a sort of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to the 1970s, that article. Little did I ever realize that some decades later, I would be taken to meet her and had two memorable meetings with her and written widely about her as have other people. And she helped found the field of ethnomycology, the anthropological study of mushrooms. Now it's a major field of inquiry. In about 1961, I was invited to participate in the psilocybin experiments at Harvard University, led by Ralph Mester, who I was mentioned a few minutes ago, Timothy Leary, and Richard Alport, later known as Ram Dass. And I was in one of the very, very last legal sessions. And I had an incredible experience under psilocybin that I've written about in several places. And it gave me great insight into the way that the psychedelics could be used in two ways: to stimulate creativity and for psychotherapy. And back in those days, the project became scandalous. Timothy Leary became a rock star of the psychedelic movement. Richard Alpert became Ram Dass, he became a guru. Ralph Mester became a serious academic, and he wrote numerous articles and books describing how psychedelics could be widely used. And I persisted, and I followed the research. I advocated the wise use of psychedelics for decades, and 50 years later, you can see the results. We now have psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and we have microdosing to evoke well-being and creativity. And back about 1963, more or less, I wrote a chapter for a book called Psychedelic Art by Gene Houston and Robert Masters, and I reported the interviews that I had made of artists and musicians who had taken psychedelics and claimed that they had enhanced their creativity. And I kept adding to that group. Eventually, I had over 100 artists and musicians, and I found several ways in which they work in common, several themes in common in terms of affecting the content of their creative work, the style of their creative work, and their evaluation of their creative work. You see, evaluation is very important because one can take a psychedelic and claim that they're having a terrific insight, and then when they sober up, they realize that their insight was sheer nonsense. So evaluation is very, very important when one takes a psychedelic and thinks they're onto something. Now, psychedelics are still somewhat unpredictable. The Food and Drug Administration, for example, has not approved MDMA, which is a minor psychedelic, but a very powerful one, as a use for serious depression because the results are not quite predictable. Some psychotherapists are using it anyway in states where it's legal, and they're generally reporting positive results. But again, the Food and Drug Administration has very, very strict guidelines, and psychedelics are so unpredictable, it's hard for them to follow these strict guidelines. I think that there are so many instances where psychedelics have fostered remarkable creative insights that we need to document them carefully. Years ago, I had an interview with Kyle Izumi, an architect, and he was called upon to design a new mental hospital. He took LSD and went into ordinary, contemporary mental hospitals, and he said that the hospital seemed like a labyrinth that went on forever. And the jagged, sharp corners of the walls seemed to be closing in on him. So he designed a mental hospital that was more user-friendly, with rounded walls, much more conducive to the mental health of the patient. And Sir Francis Crick, who was the co-discoverer of the double helix, actually took a small amount of LSD that seemed to facilitate his discovery. All of this is a matter of historical record. In terms of popular music, we know that such musicians as Frank Zappa and even the Beatles used psychedelics, and who knows what effect it had on their music. As one of the musicians told me, when it comes to composition, you use all of your life experiences. It's hard to tell what specific experience led to that particular lyric or that particular artwork. So now we have a huge convention coming up next month, March, on psychedelic science. Over 1,000 people will be attending, and dozens of people will be presenting the new research that they have done on one aspect of psychedelics or another. The most easily accessible therapeutic psychedelic is actually psilocybin. It's much more predictable. And psilocybin, of course, comes from originally the psychedelic mushroom. And LSD, of course, is very powerful, but somewhat unpredictable. And then we also have mescaline, which is a completely different psychedelic from a completely different source. And the list goes on and on and on. All of the possible uses. It's important to note that indigenous practitioners who use psychedelics in their sacred rituals and in their therapies knew what they were doing. And I think we can still learn a lot from them. They focused on what in English we call the 3 S's: the substance, the set, and the setting. In terms of the substance, you have to make sure that the ingredients are not adulterated with a lot of extra chemicals, that they are fairly pure. In ayahuasca, for example, which is a tea made from jungle plants, one has to put just the right amount of each plant into the brew for it to be psychedelic. And the dosage is also very, very important in terms of knowing what one is doing. I have been in native ceremonies with ayahuasca, and it's amazing to see how carefully the shamans and the practitioners handle things and know what they are doing. And then there is the setting, the place where it takes place. You can't just take psychedelics anywhere. You have to have a very conducive setting, hopefully a pleasant and artistically satisfying setting, one that will maybe be abetted by music or rhythm of some sort or another. And the setting can help out. And then there is the set, the expectation. What is the reason you're taking a psychedelic? You just don't take a drop of LSD out of nothing. If you do, you might have a bad trip. What is your intention? What is your purpose? The indigenous practitioners, especially the ones I visited in Mexico and Brazil, know all of this. And their clients rarely have a bad trip, rarely have an uncomfortable experience. So, just to give you an example, when I was able to visit Maria Sabina in Mexico, she was telling me she was too old to have a mushroom ceremony herself, but she referred our group to one of her students, Dona Tatilda, who later became a very famous shaman in her own right. And Dona Tatilda took us into her sanctuary, a beautiful room with pine leaves and boughs on the floor, on the concrete floor, lovely setting. And she said, it's a dry season. I only have enough mushrooms for a number of people. One of you will have to send it out. And I said, I'll be happy to send it out. I've already had the mushroom. She said, good, you can be my assistant. This is a great pleasure because I learned more being her assistant than I ever learned taking the mushroom. So we started it out by putting candles on the floor. And I noticed that she would drop some wax on the floor and stick the candle in the wax. I tried to do the same thing. It took me a long time. And then I realized that she had given me candles with a bumpy surface. All of her candles had a smooth surface on the bottom. Well, this is one way of a shaman making herself look good, making a girl look like an amateur, which of course I was. But then I did her a favor. I had some matches that would work even in rainy weather. And this was new to her. So I gave her all of my matches, and so she could have matches that other shamans did not have. Mm-hmm. So our session got underway, and then I realized why there were boughs on the floor. Some people were vomiting, they were throwing up, but they threw up into the boughs, and that covered up the stench. It was quite a session. And she would direct me to help out some people who were having trouble because she didn't speak English. I could speak Spanish, but she could not speak English. And she pointed to a couple. One of them was a former beauty queen, Miss Kentucky. And her beauty had faded, and she had nothing left to motivate her, other than a concert pianist, a Mexican, who had stage fright. And they're both struggling. And so I went over. I helped guide them through these sessions, and it worked out very well. Spanish on one side, English on the other side. And they were so grateful they started to kiss me, one on one cheek, one on the other. Ordinarily, it would be a pleasure. But the stench of their vomit was so strong, I could hardly keep from gagging. Quite a memorable experience. And then in the morning, the psychiatrist who arranged all of this, Salvador Cat, a real pioneer in this earth, came, and we had a group therapy session, and people volunteered what they had learned. So that was my experience of being an apprentice to a shaman that I learned a lot from, and which was very, very memorable. So now this work has really taken off. As I said earlier, ayahuasca is a brew made out of jungle plants, and I'm a member of an ayahuasca research group with people with a lot of experience on ayahuasca get together. It's incredible to me how much serious study is now being done with ayahuasca. Different universities are offering doctorate degrees, PhDs, on dissertations about the use of ayahuasca. And so a lot of information is becoming available on the topic. Remarkable. I document all of this, by the way, in my book, A Chaotic Life, which is my memoir. And people who are interested can get the book and read even more details about my experiences with psychedelics.
Mhm.
Now, again, I have to emphasize the point that people ask me, should I take a psychedelic? And I do not give them the go ahead. I say you have to make your own decision because the results are so unpredictable. You have to know the risk and you have to read up on literature and be familiar with the substance, the set, and the setting before you embark. And as Alan Watts once said when he was asked if you have to realize that taking a psychedelic is always risky, but nothing ventured, nothing gained. So there you have it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And my curiosity is this: once you take ayahuasca and it opens up those areas in the brain that may lie dormant, what happens once you come down from the medication? Do those parts of the brain still remain open? Like, are you changed? Is your brain now changed for you to be able to be more creative even when you're not on ayahuasca?
When you take something like ayahuasca,
Uh-huh.
there are parts of the brain that are simply bypassed. The ordinary functions of the frontal cortex are bypassed, and the parts of the brain that ordinarily focus on self identity are bypassed. And so this opens up more possibilities for you. And this allows for the creativity or the psychotherapeutic insight.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you return, yeah, the brain returns to ordinary functioning.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been people who've taken, I wouldn't recommend this, but I knew one man who's taken LSD every week for 2 years. His brain always returns to its ordinary functioning. But that is the gift that you have. It's what you've learned as a result that you put into practice. Don't expect the brain to be transformed. You can be transformed, but your brain bounces back. It's very, very resilient. Remember, the brain is very plastic. And so to amend what I just said, because the brain is so plastic, you can begin to think in new and different ways and
Yes.
actual practice in new and different ways. That will change the brain. It's not the psychedelic that changes the brain. It's what you put into practical use day by day that can change the brain. So again, follow-up is important. Integration is important with the psychedelics. And you might look at psychedelics as sort of a gift. And if it's a gift, you make the most of it. You make the most of it and put it to proper use. Again, I recently read some research. A group of prisoners in jail in Brazil were given ayahuasca, and 9 out of 10 reported positive results. One did not. Why? When he was in the middle of the psychedelic, he felt he was losing his mental health. Well, he was losing his self-identity, but that's what psychedelics do. And he did not go with the flow. And so that means he had a bad trip. He never wanted to take a psychedelic again. But again, you have to focus on the set. And people have to be told you have to go with the flow. And if it means giving up your self-identity, go ahead. It'll come back. It'll come back. So orientation is always so important.
Mm-hmm. I understand. I'm just wondering, some of the notes that I have for you is about parapsychology. And is that related to trauma, or what would you like to speak on about that?
Well, Parapsychology, of course, is a controversial field. When we talk about parapsychology, we talk about the scientific study of behaviors and experiences that cannot be easily explained by mainstream scientific paradigms. If somebody engaged in remote viewing sees something in the distance and brings it back and it's accurate, you can't explain that in terms of what we know about vision or hearing. Again, parapsychology has been discarded, it's been called a pseudoscience, but I think now it is getting some adequate attention. Again, to go back to the American Psychological Association, they recently published a book about altered states of consciousness. There's a whole section there on parapsychology, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, etc. This is a mainstream publication. And so the publication of that book indicated parapsychology is now being taken seriously. And now there are some very viable explanations based on all things like quantum physics, viable explanations about how parapsychological experiences actually work. Now, again, I've had a long experience in parapsychology, going back to my work with telepathic dreams, which I did at the Mythology Medical Center in Brooklyn for 10 years. And what we did was to have a participant interact with an experimenter, and they would establish some sort of connection or rapport, and then the participant would go into a soundproof room, and the experimenter would be given a sealed envelope drawn randomly from a stack of envelopes, going into a different room, opening up the envelope, and then trying to transmit the image. The pictures were always art prints that were very emotional, very, very vivid in nature. Mm-hmm. And in one case, the participant had a dream about going to Madison Square Garden and buying tickets for a boxing match. He had no interest in boxing. Why would he have such a dream? Well, the picture was by Shawn Mellows, both members of the club, and it showed two men boxing. But that is what we call a direct hit. So what we found out after 10 years is that the telepathy in dreams occurred far more often than could be explained by chance. And some critics said, well, this cannot be replicated. No, not true. It was replicated in several other laboratories. And a few years ago, there was analysis done of all of the telepathy dream experiments for 50 years and found that the rate of replication was similar to what you would find in more conventional psychological experiments. So those experiments are one that have passed even though time has gone by. There's also been criticism, well, if you tighten up the controls, the ESP disappears. No, this meta-analysis showed that the tighter the controls actually increase the ESP. Not significantly, but noticeably. So the criticisms simply do not hold sense. And our work in dream telepathy is one of half a dozen bodies of research that have been reported, again, in the mainstream journal of the American Psychologist. 6 bodies of research that really have passed the test of time. The remote viewing research, for example. Mm-hmm. The work that Dean Radin has done at the Institute of Noetic Science, solid bodies of research. I think that the criticisms of parapsychology have become muted over the years because now there is so much solid evidence that cannot easily be discounted. So, of course, parapsychology is important in the study of consciousness because it indicates that consciousness is not limited by time and space, that occasionally, if not frequently,
Yes.
You can transcend limits of time and space. And this might be a more important phenomena in our daily life than we realize. So this is why parapsychology needs to be taken seriously in the study of consciousness.
Well, I love that. And the name of my new podcast, Stanley, is Nature of Consciousness. And I just had a feeling that this was a topic that more people want to talk about, is the nature of our own consciousness and how we are able to receive messages to our conscious mind and send messages, even though we might not think that we're sending messages, but our thoughts are messages, and our thoughts go out to many places. And so I really appreciate you talking about parapsychology, because I feel that it's a subject that a lot of people want to stay away from or don't want to admit that they have these messages. But it's easier for people to talk about their dreams and say that they dreamt something and then it came true.
Well, again, part of our work at my medical center in Brooklyn
Uh-huh.
involved dreams about an event that was yet to happen. And that work was just about as significant as the dream telepathy work. My recommendation is if people want to explore this, they keep a dream diary or dream journal. Now that they have computers, they can record their dreams on their computer.
Mm-hmm.
And if they have that record, they will know if a dream about the future can come true or not. Now, sometimes dreams have come true about very, very trivial events, but sometimes they're very, very serious events.
Yes.
There are cases where people dreamed about the event who really been life-saving. Well, how do you know unless you have actually written it down in some detail and can go back and check the details? Also, because your podcast is the nature of consciousness, I have to emphasize that part of the nature of consciousness is critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
To use your own common sense,
Yes.
to not take anything for granted, and to be very critical in what you accept and what you reject. Also, it helps to have a group of sympathetic people. Many people hesitate to mention a dream that came true to their friends because they'll be laughed at. Well, just ignore those friends. Try to find somebody who's more receptive.
Mm-hmm.
And the more support you have, the more social support, the more often you will have these types of dreams. I remember one case, not from my own child, from somebody else's child, where a woman was in a small apartment with her husband and their baby, and the baby's crib was underneath a chandelier. And the woman had a dream that the chandelier had fallen on the bed, killing the baby. Well, her husband said, no, just a dream, just a dream. She took the baby into her own bed, and in the middle of the night, there was a crash. Sure enough, the chandelier had fallen on the crib.
Boy.
So, precognitive dreams, dreams about the future, can actually change a person's life or save a person's life if they're correctly interpreted and taken seriously.
Mm-hmm. Well, Stanley, when I was pregnant with my son, I dreamt many times that I had a blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby boy, and that's what I had. And years later, while I was pregnant, I dreamt 3 times that I had a dark-haired, dark-eyed baby girl, and that's what I had. And so I think mothers, and I talked with Russell Targ about this, and he said that, sometimes women, when they're pregnant, can have these types of dreams.
There was actually a large study done in Romania, of all places, that collected women's dreams about the sex of their babies. And more often than not, those dreams were correct. But not always, not always. You can't expect dreams to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they're wish fulfillment. So, again, if people record their dreams, like dreams about the sex of their baby, then they can double check and find out if the dream was accurate or not. Now, yours is especially important because dream about the sex of the baby might be due to Here, hormonal changes during pregnancy is different for boy babies than for girl babies. But in your case, you had the blonde hair, the blue eyes. That's something not easily explained by hormonal differences.
Mm-hmm.
That's especially important. Again, for people to explore their consciousness and study their dreams, keep their record, and then in retrospect, you can find out if the dreams come true. I think one has to realize that cognitive dreams, dreams abilities, are very, very small parts of dreams. Dreams occur for many, many reasons.
Yes.
The main reason that we dream is to integrate experiences of the day into our personal life, which is all done with symbols and metaphors, of course. And once it serves the purpose, fine, then you move on and get on with your sleep. Once in a while, dreams can serve a problem-solving function.
Yes.
That once in a while, dreams can help resolve a trauma. And very, very rarely can dreams predict a future event. This is a minor, minor portion of why we dream. Dreams are so important to one's mental health that the issue is not what we dream, but why we dream. Getting a good night's sleep, allowing for dream time, is important for one's physical and mental health. Absolutely.
Oh, yes. Yes. Definitely. Definitely. Well, it's been a pleasure to be in your company again, Stanley, and learn from you. I've really enjoyed it. And, I mean, there's so much knowledge that you have that we could probably talk for another hour. And so maybe we'll do that at a different time.
You asked such good questions, Ron. We can do it again in the future. I just hope that our comments today have been useful and interesting to your viewers and that they learned a lot about the nature of consciousness.
Yes, it's very, very informative. I learned from you, so I'm sure our listeners will as well. So I thank you for your genius and spending time with me today. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening and being part of the journey with Nature of Consciousness, your host, Rhonda Grant. Theme song is composed and performed by John Park Wheeler.